The plague of Justinian didn't just kill, it transformed. In its wake, the world that had once seemed solid and eternal began to shift. The Roman order, already weakened, began to fracture in quieter, more permanent ways. With vast numbers of people gone, the structure of society loosened. Fields were left untended, villages abandoned. Landowners, once powerful, now lacked workers. Survivors, especially peasants and laborers, found themselves in rare demand. In some places, they negotiated better conditions. A slow rebalancing of power began, one that chipped away at the rigid class systems inherited from Rome. The church, too, changed. It had tried to offer answers during the crisis, but it was wounded. Many priests and monks had died. Those who remained turned toward mysticism, miracles, and personal salvation. The church didn't lose influence, but it grew more emotional, more otherworldly, as people searched for meaning in the chaos. Politically, the plague deepened the East-West divide. Justinian's dream of reuniting the Roman Empire was gone. Byzantium began turning inward, away from Latin-speaking West and toward a Greek, more insulated future. Meanwhile, in Western Europe, central authority withered. Power passed into the hands of local lords, bishops, and warlords. Cities faded. Rural strongholds rose. The transition to the Middle Ages wasn't marked by a single war or revolution. It came quietly through demographic collapse, shifting faith, and social unraveling. The old world did not end with a bang. It ended with a plague. In the end, the plague of Justinian was more than a public health crisis. It was a turning point. A slow, silent fracture that changed the course of history, not in a single explosion, but in a long, suffocating breath. It arrived quietly, killed relentlessly, and left behind a world that no longer fit the dreams of the men who once ruled it. Some pandemics take lives, this one took a future. Justinian dreamed of restoring the Roman Empire, of reuniting East and West under law, faith, and order. He had the armies, he had the vision, he even had the time. But what he did not have and could never command was immunity. The plague didn't just steal people from his cities, it stole the momentum of history. It broke the machinery of empire. It choked off the revival before it could fully bloom. What followed was not collapse, but slow erosion. The great marble structures remained, but the voices inside them grew quieter. The roads still stretched from one province to another, but fewer feet walked them. The laws remained in ink and parchment, but the people to enforce them or obey them were often gone. That is how pandemics destroy civilizations, not through fire but through absence, not in noise but in the hollow silence left behind. And yet, for all its devastation, the plague of Justinian was forgotten, lost beneath layers of dust and time. It left few monuments, few names, no great literary works, no epic elegies, just empty houses, abandoned fields. Broken inheritance. It is only now, through science, archaeology, and a fresh awareness of fragility, that we hear its voice again. And in hearing it, we must ask, what else have we forgotten? What other warnings have we buried beneath the weight of convenience and pride? Because history does not shout, it does not repeat itself in obvious terms, but it whispers, and if we are wise, we'll learn to listen before the silence returns. There are moments in history when numbers lose their meaning, when counting no longer matters because what's being measured is too vast, too cruel, too final. The plague of Justinian was such a moment. Historians estimate that between 30 to 50 million people died across the Eastern Roman Empire and its surrounding territories. That may have been nearly half the population of the known world at the time. In Constantinople alone, contemporary sources claim the dead reached 10,000 per day at the height of the outbreak. Whether those numbers are exaggerated or not hardly matters, because the evidence is written in the silence that followed. Entire neighborhoods were emptied, markets never reopened, monasteries became mausoleums. There were simply not enough people left to bury the dead, let alone replace them. In the countryside, it was even worse. villages vanished from maps. Farmers collapsed in their fields, their crops left to rot in the sun. The roads became overgrown, unused, caravans ceased to travel. Entire regions became ghost lands. Without laborers, the food supply failed. Without tax collectors, the imperial treasury starved. Without people, the empire stalled. The scale of death reshaped the rhythm of life itself. In cities, families locked themselves in their homes, not to protect against thieves, but against neighbors. Doors once used to welcome guests were now used to seal out the world. When the carts stopped coming and the priests stopped praying, people began to bury their own dead beneath their homes, or burn them, or simply leave them behind. Even time seemed to stop, births dropped, marriages were postponed. In many places, entire generations were lost. Children grew up without parents. Grandparents buried their sons and daughters, only to die alone a week later. And when the plague finally passed, when the coughing stopped and the carts emptied, the survivors looked around and saw a world they no longer recognized. Death did not visit the empire, it moved in. And long after the symptoms faded, the emptiness remained. The plague of Justinian didn't just bring death, it brought economic paralysis. The empire's well-oiled machine, built on agriculture, trade, taxation, and military campaigns, began to fall apart piece by piece. With farmers dying in droves, crops were left unharvested. Fields turned to weeds, livestock wandered unattended, and grain supplies shrank. Cities starved, prices soared, and soon even bread became a luxury. Trade networks, once the pride of Byzantium, collapsed. Merchant ships stopped sailing. Foreign traders avoided infected ports. Roads emptied. Markets fell silent. The goods that once flowed through the empire like blood through veins now slowed to a trickle or disappeared entirely. Taxes, the backbone of imperial finance, could no longer be collected. The bureaucrats were dead. The taxpayers were dead. Whole towns vanished from the empire's ledgers. Revenue dried up just as the empire needed it most. Military campaigns stalled. Garrisons went unpaid. Provincial governors wrote desperate letters that never received answers. Public works were abandoned. Construction stopped. Even basic infrastructure, roads, aqueducts, city maintenance, began to fail. Without money, without manpower, the emperor's grand vision of a restored Roman Empire crumbled. And the survivors, they were left in a world where silver held less value than bread, and where a strong back was more prized than noble blood. Labor shortages shifted the balance of power briefly, but chaos outweighed opportunity. Inflation surged, debts went unpaid. The empire limped forward, hollowed out from within. The plague had done what no invading army could. It didn't just weaken the empire, it broke its foundation. As the plague swept through the empire, the church was thrust into the center of the storm. At first, priests turned to familiar rituals, incense-filled processions, public prayers, and mass confessions. Bishops urged the faithful to repent, believing the plague was divine punishment for the sins of the people, and many believed them. In a world where heaven and hell felt closer than flesh and bone, the line between illness and judgment was thin. The sermons darkened. Clergy preached that the empire's pride, greed, and wars had provoked God's wrath. People fasted. Some walked barefoot through the streets, weeping and begging for mercy. Others joined spontaneous processions, chanting hymns through tear-streaked faces. But still, the dying continued. Soon, the church itself began to break. Monasteries became places of infection. Monks and nuns who stayed to care for the sick died by the dozens. Priests vanished from parishes. In some towns, no one was left to bury the dead or bless the dying. The most sacred places in the empire fell silent, altars dark, bells still. And yet faith did not disappear. In the void left by crumbling institutions, belief transformed. Some turned to apocalyptic preachers. Others clung harder to prayer, lighting candles and whispering psalms while death scratched at their door. Small acts of courage, clergy burying the dead, feeding orphans, comforting the sick, offered fragile hope. When the plague finally passed, the church remained, but changed. Its rituals had failed to stop the suffering, yet its presence had offered meaning. And in a wounded empire, that was enough to deepen its power. At the height of the plague, death outpaced the living. Each morning in Constantinople began with the same grim sight. Bodies piled outside homes, wrapped in whatever cloth could be found, bed linens, rugs, old cloaks. The living no longer had the strength or courage to bury their dead. They simply placed them outside and shut the door. The city's morgues and burial sites, never built for such numbers, collapsed under the strain. Cemeteries overflowed. The church tried to maintain dignity, but soon even priests could no longer keep pace with the dead. Mass graves were dug in the fields beyond the city walls, shallow pits filled with layer upon layer of corpses, covered quickly with earth to keep the smell at bay. But the smell always returned. Sweet, thick, sickening, it clung to clothes, to walls, to memory. Eventually, when land ran out, people began throwing the dead into the sea. Barges were loaded with bodies and pushed from the shore, where they floated aimlessly or were carried back in by the current. Fishermen refused to cast their nets, shorelines became graveyards, the water turned still and dark as if mourning. The streets of Constantinople became unholy places. Dogs and rats picked at the remains of the unburied. Vultures circled above the forum. In poorer districts, the dead were left to rot where they fell. Children stepped over corpses to reach wells. In the alleys, death no longer shocked. It became background noise, part of life. And as days passed, so did shame. Some families burned their dead in secret. Others sealed them in abandoned homes. Few spoke of it. There were no funerals, no mourning robes, only the hope that the next breath wouldn't be their last. This wasn't just a health crisis, it was the disintegration of death itself. The rituals that once gave meaning to loss, prayers, processions, graves with names, were stripped away. All that remained were bones piled in silence. And an empire forced to keep walking through the stench of its own undoing. The plague did not merely strike bodies, it broke the fragile threads that held society together. In the beginning, people clung to one another. Neighbors helped bury neighbors. Priests offered comfort, families stayed close, believing love could shield them from death. But as the days dragged on and the bodies multiplied, that solidarity began to crack. Then it shattered. Fear replaced compassion. The very presence of another human being became a threat. Friends stopped visiting each other. Markets emptied not just from hunger, but from terror. Doors were locked, not against thieves, but against loved ones. Children who coughed were hidden. Parents who showed signs of fever were left in back rooms to die alone. A father might carry his son's body into the street in the morning, and by nightfall he too would be dead, his house sealed shut by frightened neighbors. As the city descended into chaos, civil order collapsed, magistrates disappeared, guards abandoned their posts, laws became irrelevant when there was no one left to enforce them. Theft surged, food, medicine, candles, clothing. Not for wealth, but for survival. Men broke into bakeries for moldy bread. Women fought over dried herbs in the marketplace. If you had something, anything, you learned to hide it. In the vacuum of order, violence crept in. In the darkened streets of Constantinople, gangs formed, not organized criminals, but desperate survivors. Groups of the half-mad who scavenged homes, robbed the sick, and fought over the dead's belongings. Bodies were stripped of jewelry, boots, even tunics. Corpses were no longer sacred, they were commodities. Families, too, came undone. Sons abandoned fathers, husbands fled their wives. Mothers, overwhelmed by grief and hunger, left infants behind and vanished into the alleys. It wasn't cruelty, it was exhaustion. People could not carry the weight of loss anymore. They began to drift apart like stones sliding down the side of a ruined wall. What had once been a city of structure, duty, and order now resembled a ghost, haunted, staggering, hollow. And yet, perhaps the most terrifying part wasn't the screaming or the silence. It was the normalization of it all. After weeks of death, people stopped crying. They stopped speaking of hope. They walked past corpses without flinching. The soul of the empire wasn't just wounded, it was numb. The plague unstitched the very fabric of Byzantine society, not in one swift cut, but thread by thread, and when it was done, the empire was still standing. But it no longer remembered what it felt like to be whole. Most disasters, no matter how devastating, come to an end. Fires burn out, wars are settled, even famines pass with the changing of seasons. But the plague of Justinian was different. It did not strike once and vanish, it became a presence, a rhythm of death that haunted the empire for over 2 centuries. After the first outbreak in 542, when Constantinople had buried tens of thousands and the empire staggered under the weight of loss, there was a brief silence. The city began to recover, markets reopened, fields were replanted, but the relief was short-lived. Within a few years, the plague returned, smaller but no less deadly. Then it came again and again. Between the 6th and 8th centuries, at least 18 distinct waves of plague were recorded, each cutting down a new generation, each spreading fear that the nightmare would never end. The disease no longer had to travel from distant lands. It was already here, hiding in the countryside, re-emerging in ports, following the empire's trade routes like a cruel tide. Whole towns vanished between outbreaks. Some villages never recovered. Children grew up not knowing what life without plague felt like. Entire family lines ended. Survivors stopped asking if it would come back. They asked when. Each wave of plague weakened the empire further. With every resurgence, the population shrank. There were never enough farmers to till the land, soldiers to guard the borders, or workers to build what had crumbled. The economy, already hollowed out by the first blow, was left gasping. And politically, Constantinople's grip on distant provinces loosened. Governors ruled with more autonomy. Enemies sensed the weakness. Spiritually, the people turned inward. Churches became places of mourning more than celebration. Holy relics were paraded through the streets in desperate hope. Saints were prayed to, candles lit, processions held, but beneath it all was fatigue. Grief no longer shocked, it settled like dust. By the time the last major wave of the Justinianic plague swept through in the 750s, the empire had changed beyond recognition. It was still there, its walls still stood, its emperor still ruled, but something vital had been lost. Its size, its confidence, its sense of destiny. The plague had not simply passed through the empire, it had settled inside it, a slow, quiet erasure of lives, dreams, and power, generation after generation. At the start of his reign, Justinian dreamed not of ruling a corner of a fallen empire, but of restoring the Roman world. He envisioned a unified realm stretching from the deserts of Africa to the forests of Gaul, from the gates of Persia to the Atlantic shores. With brilliant generals like Belisarius, he reclaimed Carthage, then Rome itself. His legal reforms gave structure to chaos. His churches, like the Hagia Sophia, seemed to defy heaven. For a moment it truly seemed that the Roman Empire might live again, but the plague changed everything. With half the population gone, tax revenues dried up, recruitment for the army faltered. Cities that had been retaken at great cost were now impossible to hold. Italy, Spain, even parts of Africa, territories once reconquered, were gradually lost. The Western dream was slipping away, not through war or rebellion, but through silence, absence, and decay. Even in the East, the empire grew brittle, defenses crumbled, enemies advanced, and the emperor himself, once tireless, grew older, changed. Though Justinian survived the plague, the man who rose from that fever was no longer the same visionary. His gaze narrowed, his ambition softened, the builder became the caretaker. By the time of his death in 565, much of what he had won was already gone. The restoration had failed, not with a dramatic collapse, but with slow retreat. The plague had drained the blood from his dream, and with it, a part of the Roman world died forever. It is one of the great paradoxes of history. How can a plague that killed tens of millions, that crippled the most powerful empire of its time, vanish from collective memory? The plague of Justinian was one of the deadliest pandemics the world has ever seen, by some estimates as lethal as the Black Death, and yet today few people even know it happened. The answer lies not in the scale of suffering, but in what was left behind. The Black Death struck a Europe in cultural bloom, rising literacy, printing presses, an obsession with death and religion that found its way into art, music, and law. But in the 6th century, the world was different. Literacy was limited, records were few. The educated elite who could write about the plague were themselves dying, or too consumed by survival to chronicle it fully. Those who did write, like Procopius, were later dismissed as melodramatic or biased. More importantly, there were no lasting institutions to carry the memory forward. Entire towns and communities were wiped out, leaving no descendants to tell their story. No surviving diaries, no murals of dancing skeletons, no folk songs or morality plays. Even the church, which had recorded so much of the medieval world's crises, struggled to preserve the scale of this one. The trauma was so overwhelming and so repetitive that over time it simply dissolved into silence. And timing mattered too. The plague coincided with a turning point in world history. The Western Roman Empire had already collapsed, and the Eastern Empire, Byzantium, was increasingly isolated in language and tradition. The Latin West, which would later dominate global scholarship, looked eastward with little interest. When Renaissance thinkers rediscovered Rome, they did so through marble ruins and manuscripts, not through the memory of those who had died coughing in alleyways. The result was historical eclipse. The plague of Justinian became a footnote in Roman decline, a minor detail in the rise of medieval Europe. It was forgotten not because it didn't matter, but because those who remembered it disappeared. Memory depends on continuity, and the plague shattered that chain. In the end, the world did not carve the names of its victims into stone. It did not sing for them. It moved on scarred but silent. And so, the first great pandemic of the Western world faded into shadow, waiting for science and archaeology to bring it back to light. For centuries, the plague of Justinian lingered in the background of history, mentioned in dusty chronicles, debated by scholars, but largely forgotten by the public. Unlike the Black Death, it left behind few monuments, few memories. Many doubted its scale. Some even questioned whether it had been a true plague at all. Then came science. In recent decades, archaeologists uncovered 6th century mass graves across Europe, from Bavaria to the eastern Mediterranean. These weren't soldiers. The bodies bore no wounds, no signs of battle. They had died suddenly and in large numbers. The clues pointed to something invisible and fast. Using advanced DNA extraction techniques, scientists examined the teeth of these ancient remains, and there it was. Yersinia pestis, the same bacterium that caused the Black Death, not a guess, not a theory, proof. The plague that shattered Justinian's empire was no mystery illness. It was real, and it was the same killer that would return 800 years later. Genetic analysis showed it wasn't an ancestor of the 14th century strain, but a cousin, another branch of the same deadly tree. Suddenly, ancient descriptions of swelling, fever, and sudden death were no longer suspect. They were confirmed. The historians had been right all along. Modern science didn't just identify a bacterium. It unearthed a forgotten catastrophe. It gave voice to millions who died unremembered. And it reminded us that the diseases of the past are never as distant as we like to believe. When COVID-19 brought the modern world to a halt, echoes of the past emerged, loud and unsettling. Historians were reminded that this was not the first time an empire had watched, helpless, as a plague reshaped its destiny. The plague of Justinian, though ancient, mirrors many of our recent fears with eerie familiarity. In the 6th century, as in today, fear spread faster than facts. People speculated wildly about poisoned air, divine punishment, or foreign enemies. Without clear knowledge of transmission, panic took root. During COVID-19, misinformation again flourished, from social media myths to politicized narratives. Despite 1,500 years of progress, uncertainty remained a powerful, dangerous force. Medical systems in both eras crumbled under pressure. Justinian's doctors were powerless. Constantinople's hospitals were overwhelmed. Likewise, in 2020, even modern healthcare bent under the strain. Beds filled, supplies ran out, frontline workers broke down. The similarities were sobering. Economically, both pandemics disrupted everything. The ancient world saw fields untended, trade routes broken, cities starving. Modern supply chains froze, flights stopped, shops shuttered. The world's wealthiest nations were reminded just how fragile global systems truly are, but perhaps the most haunting similarity lies in how people reacted. In Byzantium, neighbors stopped speaking. Families locked their doors. In our time, isolation returned behind masks, behind screens, behind closed borders. Trust dissolved under the weight of invisible danger. And yet, in both times, acts of compassion endured. Caregivers risked their lives. Communities adapted. Though shaken, humanity did not fall. We mourned, we feared, but we also helped. The tools have changed. The instincts have not. The plague of Justinian is not just a distant tragedy. It's a mirror. One that shows how deeply human our struggles have always been. Twilight settles over the imperial skyline of Constantinople. The last rays of sun wash the marble domes and spires in gold, but the beauty hides a growing horror. The city, once the beating heart of the Eastern Roman Empire, is silent in a way that feels unnatural. Its streets, once crowded with merchants, priests, and scholars, are now deserted. Market stalls stand abandoned. The laughter of children and the chants of clergy have faded into whispers of dread. The capital of the world has begun to die. Down near the harbor, where grain ships from Egypt used to unload by the dozen, a strange quiet has taken hold. No workers move among the crates, ropes hang slack, rats scurry through spilled grain. Along the docks, human figures lie crumpled and still, wrapped in makeshift shrouds. Their skin is blackened, their limbs frozen in agony. There are too many bodies to bury. Carts creak through the streets, driven by men who no longer pray, no longer cry. They gather the dead in silence and wheel them to hastily dug trenches behind churches and city walls. Even the priests have grown weary of last rites. The air stinks of decay and fear. In the richer districts, shutters are nailed closed. Wealth buys no protection now. Servants have fled. Families isolate in locked rooms, counting coughs, watching one another with suspicion. And within the great palace, behind silk curtains and guards too afraid to breathe deeply, lies the emperor, Justinian. He too is burning with fever. The ruler of the Eastern Empire, the man who dreamed of restoring Roman glory, is powerless against the thing that now stalks his people. You know of the Black Death, everyone does. The plague that swept across Europe in the 14th century, leaving death in its wake and reshaping civilization. But few remember that it was not the first. Nearly 800 years earlier, another plague struck the known world, deadlier, faster, and just as merciless. It came not to the medieval kingdoms of the West, but to the shining heart of Rome reborn. The Byzantine Empire, the city of Justinian, the future that might have been. They called it the Plague of Justinian. It killed millions. Some say up to half the empire's population vanished in its grip. It paralyzed armies, ended conquests, collapsed cities. And then history forgot. This is the story of that forgotten pandemic, of the death that came before the Black Death. Of how a single disease nearly destroyed an empire, and reshaped the fate of the world forever. To understand the plague that shattered an empire, we must travel back, not to the Dark Ages, but to a world still basking in the afterglow of Roman glory. The year is 541 AD. The Western Roman Empire has already crumbled, torn apart by warlords and tribal kingdoms, but in the East, Rome lives on. Its heart now beats in Constantinople, a city of mosaics, domes, and stone forums that echo with the language of Caesar and the hymns of Christ. This is the Byzantine Empire, but its citizens call it Roman. To them, the empire never fell, it merely shifted. Its armies still march in armor, its laws still echo the codes of ancient senators, and its emperors still rule with the authority of Augustus. And ruling now in this moment of fragile grandeur is a man whose ambition matches that of the greatest Roman leaders before him, Flavius Petrus Sabatius Justinianus. The world knows him as Emperor Justinian. Justinian is no ordinary ruler. Born to a peasant family in the Balkans, he rose through the imperial court not by birthright but by brilliance. A man of endless energy, fierce intellect, and unshakable will, Justinian has set his sights on a single, monumental goal: reuniting the Roman world. He wants to bring the lost western provinces, Italy, North Africa, even distant Spain, back under the control of Constantinople. Not as a mere dream, but as a divine mission. To him, the empire is not just a political entity. It is the vessel of Christian civilization, the ordained successor of Roman greatness, and he, its chosen architect. Under his command, massive reforms sweep the empire. He commissions the Corpus Juris Civilis, a codification of Roman law that will shape legal systems for centuries. He orders the construction of the Hagia Sophia, a cathedral so vast and luminous it seems to touch the heavens. He surrounds himself with powerful minds: his wife Theodora, a former actress turned empress and his most trusted advisor; his general Belisarius, a military genius who wins battles with brilliance and boldness; and jurists, scholars, priests, men who believe they are building the world anew, and for a time it works. His armies reconquer Carthage from the Vandals, then Sicily, then Rome. The empire expands once more. Church and state unite in vision and voice. Constantinople shines as a city of faith and might. From the outside, it looks as though the Roman phoenix is rising again, spreading its wings over the Mediterranean world. But even golden ages cast shadows. Behind the triumphs lie deep strains. The wars are costly, draining the treasury and bleeding the army. The empire's borders stretch thin, revolts simmer beneath the surface. The poor suffer under crushing taxes, the elite jostle for power in gilded halls, and beneath the city streets, unseen and unspoken, something darker brews, something no general can defeat, no law can restrain. And no emperor, no matter how brilliant, can command. The year is 541. The Byzantine Empire is reaching for its highest point, and the plague is already on its way. Before the first cough echoed in the alleys of Constantinople, before the carts of corpses rolled through its marble streets, the Byzantine Empire stood tall, confident, prosperous, and radiant with imperial ambition. In the early 540s, this was not the fading echo of Rome, it was Rome reborn. The Eastern Empire under Emperor Justinian believed itself the rightful heir to the Caesars, and for a moment it truly seemed unstoppable. Justinian ruled with a vision larger than his crown. He sought not just to defend his empire, but to restore the full glory of the Roman world. His general, Belisarius, marched westward with a lean, disciplined army and reclaimed North Africa from the Vandals. Soon after, they landed in Sicily and then Italy. Rome, yes, the city of Rome itself, fell once more under imperial banners. Province by province, the West was being stitched back into the empire's robe. Yet Justinian's ambitions went far beyond war. He reformed the empire's legal foundations, commissioning the Corpus Juris Civilis, a sweeping codification of Roman law. It became the cornerstone of European legal tradition, long after Byzantium itself had faded. He also rebuilt the spiritual heart of the empire. After the devastating Nika riots, Justinian ordered the construction of a cathedral unlike any the world had seen. In just 5 years, the Hagia Sophia rose from the ashes, its vast dome floating like a divine halo above the city. It was a monument not just to God, but to the emperor's unshakable will. Constantinople pulsed with life. Its markets brimmed with spices and silks, its schools taught law, theology, and philosophy. Its artists filled churches with golden mosaics. To the people of the empire it was clear, Rome had not fallen, Rome had merely shifted east. But beneath this dazzling facade something invisible crept closer. The empire was stretched thin by war, its people burdened by taxes, its cities crowded, ripe for something ancient to awaken. No army could stop what was coming. No law could prevent it. At the height of its brilliance, the Byzantine Empire was about to meet the enemy it never anticipated, plague. It began, as these things often do, with a murmur carried along the wind from the south. Traders in Alexandria spoke of something strange in the Red Sea ports, of people collapsing in the streets, of whole caravans falling silent. At first, no one in Constantinople paid much attention. Illness was common in distant lands. Plague was a word reserved for ancient times, not the golden age of Justinian, and yet the whispers kept coming. By early 541, those whispers had hardened into worry. Letters from Egypt described fever and swelling, of bodies buried hastily and temples filled not with worshippers, but with the dead. In Pelusium, the great Egyptian port where the Nile met the Mediterranean, something new had taken hold. Sailors arrived from East Africa carrying grain and death. Some never even made it to shore. They collapsed aboard their ships, breathless and bloated. Those who did disembark brought more than goods. They brought contagion, invisible, incurable. Inevitable, from Pelusium the sickness spread westward along the coast, then north, town by town, port by port. The disease followed the arteries of commerce like a shadow, hitching rides in the holds of ships, tucked into crates of spices, hiding in bundles of cloth. The Roman Empire had spent centuries perfecting its roads, its trade routes, its maritime connections. Now, all of that efficiency turned against it. The very system that kept the empire fed and rich was now the system that would deliver its ruin. In the harbor cities of Syria and Palestine, people began dying faster than they could be counted. In Gaza, priests walked the streets chanting blessings over the sick while holding rags to their faces. In Antioch, the gates were shut too late. Merchants who had traveled south returned with more than coin. Within days, the city's fountains ran red, not with blood, but with the rust of abandonment. No one remained to maintain them. The disease moved with the speed of sails and wind, and all the while Constantinople remained unaware, or worse, unwilling to listen. Imperial officials dismissed the letters as exaggerated. They had wars to fund, churches to build, laws to pass. What was one more sickness in a far-off province, but some began to worry. Port masters noticed a change. Ships docked with skeleton crews. Grain shipments dwindled. Captains reported crews dying mid-voyage. In the taverns near the sea wall, talk turned uneasy. And then came the moment no one could ignore. A merchant vessel arrived from Egypt in the spring of 542, carrying rotting cargo, a dead crew, and something far worse hiding in its straw. The plague had crossed the sea, and Constantinople would never be the same again. The plague did not march in with soldiers or siege engines. It arrived quietly, tucked in the shadows of trade. Ships from Egypt pulled into the harbors of Constantinople, just as they always had, laden with grain, textiles, and exotic goods. But this time, something else came with them. Hidden among the straw and cargo were rats, swarming and restless. Clinging to their bodies were fleas carrying a deadly secret, Yersinia pestis, the plague. The Byzantine Empire had built its strength on connection. Its roads and sea routes stitched together 3 continents. Grain from Egypt fed the capital. Spices from India passed through Syrian ports. But the same networks that enriched the empire now became the channels of its destruction. The disease traveled with terrifying speed, carried by rats leaping from ship to dock, from dock to home, from home to church. Fleas bit animals, then people. Infections erupted almost invisibly until they didn't. At first the symptoms were brushed aside, a fever here, a swelling there, but within hours the signs grew grotesque: blackened skin, delirium, sudden death. Dockworkers collapsed beside their cargo, priests died mid-sermon. Bodies piled up faster than they could be buried, and Constantinople wasn't the only target. The plague rode outbound ships like a passenger, reaching Athens, Antioch, Rome, Carthage. Every thriving trade hub became a new outbreak. Every port that welcomed the empire's commerce now received its curse. By the time imperial authorities grasped the danger, it had already taken root. The empire's very lifeblood, trade, had become its poison. The network that connected the world was now the thread unraveling it. It began with quiet deaths along the harbor, dockworkers, merchants, sailors found cold and still beside their cargo. At first, no one sounded the alarm. Illness in a city like Constantinople was nothing new, but within days the numbers rose with terrifying speed. Entire families disappeared behind shuttered doors. The plague had arrived, and the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire was unprepared. In the crowded lower quarters near the sea, bodies began to appear in the streets. Children wailed beside lifeless parents. The smell of decay lingered like fog. Then it moved inland, through marketplaces, across neighborhoods. Into homes both poor and noble. The wealthy tried to escape. The poor had nowhere to go. Priests led processions, praying for divine mercy, then collapsed before they reached the altar. Soon, even the palace felt the grip of death. Justinian himself fell ill, writhing in fever, his survival uncertain. Without his command, the empire drifted. Panic overtook reason. Rumors spread like fire, some blamed sorcery, others divine punishment. But no explanation slowed the dying. Constantinople had become a city of silence, broken only by the creak of carts filled with corpses and the cries of the newly infected. Burial sites overflowed, mass graves were dug. When space ran out, the dead were thrown into the sea, but the sea could not hold them all. Bodies washed back onto the shore, an omen no one could ignore, and then came the despair. Families abandoned one another, servants deserted masters. The instinct to survive became stronger than love, loyalty, or law. This was no longer just a crisis. It was collapse, the greatest city in the known world, crippled not by siege but by plague. As death spread like wildfire through the streets of Constantinople, no one truly believed it could reach the palace. The imperial walls were thick, the guards loyal, the halls lined with marble and gold. The emperor, after all, was God's chosen. He was the living symbol of divine order on earth. If the plague could claim him, what hope was there for the rest of the empire? But by late spring of 542, the unthinkable happened. Emperor Justinian, the man who had ruled with unmatched energy and vision, fell ill. Fever struck first, leaving him drenched in sweat and too weak to rise. Then came the swelling, painful lumps in his groin and armpits, sores on his skin. He drifted in and out of consciousness, raving in delirium, sometimes silent for hours. Courtiers whispered outside his chambers. Priests gathered in the halls, already preparing funeral rites. The empire held its breath. Justinian's illness was more than a personal crisis. It was a political catastrophe. With the emperor incapacitated, decisions stalled. The military lost its direction. The court fractured as rivals quietly maneuvered for influence. Some feared a civil war, others feared divine judgment. The Empress Theodora, ever defiant, stepped forward to hold the reins. Strong-willed and sharp-tongued, she ordered the court to continue its work, threatened governors who panicked, and kept the machinery of empire alive, but even she could not slow the rising death toll beyond the palace gates. And yet, against all odds, Justinian survived. After weeks of hovering at death's door, his fever broke. Slowly, painfully, the swelling receded. He regained his voice, then his strength. When he finally emerged from his chambers, pale and hollow-eyed, it was as if a ghost had taken the throne. But the empire had not lost its emperor. Not yet. Still, something had changed. Justinian's survival brought no celebration. The empire was too broken to rejoice. The plague continued its rampage through the provinces. Armies disbanded, trade withered. The streets of the capital remained half empty. And the emperor himself, though physically alive, was no longer the man who had once dreamed of uniting Rome. He had stared death in the face, and though he had endured, his vision had dimmed. The plague had not just struck his body, it had shaken his soul. And in the months that followed, the empire would learn that even an emperor's recovery could not stop what had already been set in motion. The plague crept in quietly, disguised as a common fever. At first it was easy to dismiss, a slight chill, a sudden warmth, fatigue, but within hours the body began to revolt. Victims burned with fever, soaked in sweat one moment and shivering the next. Then came the swellings, large black lumps that formed under the arms, in the groin, along the neck. Painful, pulsing, and hot to the touch, they were the plague's cruel signature. These buboes were often followed by violent delirium. The sick raved in half-sleep, calling out for lost loved ones, for God, for mercy. Some clawed at their skin, others screamed in agony until they lost their voices. A few fell silent altogether, still breathing but vacant-eyed, waiting for death to come. Skin turned dark, fingers blackened, blood leaked from the nose and mouth. The stench of death lingered long before it arrived. For many, death came quickly, within 2 or 3 days. Some collapsed in the streets with no warning. Others died alone in locked rooms, their bodies undiscovered for days. Entire households perished in a matter of hours. Neighbors dared not knock, even priests grew afraid to enter. Physicians were powerless. Remedies ranged from prayer to vinegar-soaked cloths, but nothing worked. Fear spread faster than the disease. People avoided touch, avoided eye contact, avoided hope. In some places, the silence became heavier than the crying. The symptoms were more than signs of illness, they were a reminder of helplessness. The empire's wealth, knowledge, and faith were no match for what had taken hold. Constantinople, the jewel of the Mediterranean, was now a city of fever, rot, and shadows.